Let's talk about guns and gun violence and the Second Amendment. A lot of my colleagues in Congress are absolutely convinced and insist that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to give the people the right to overthrow the government, which is why we can't ban the sale of AR-15s and other weapons of war on the streets of America. It's why we cannot have a universal violent criminal background check. This argument, which adopts the NRA orthodoxy on it now, suggests that the purpose of the Second Amendment is to give the people an arsenal at least equal to or greater than that of the government, so that if the government turns tyrannical, the people can engage in insurrection against the government.
I think Hui might not be strong enough.
Yeah. Well, when we get in these debates, I give a legalistic rebuttal to it. I say, well, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to call forth the militias of the states in order to repel invasions and suppress insurrections. The Republican Guarantee Clause says that Congress must guarantee the people of the states a Republican form of government, not a Republican Party form of government, but a representative form of government, and must assist the states in suppressing domestic violence. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that if you've served in office, you've sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against enemies, foreign and domestic, and you violate the oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion, you shall never be allowed to hold federal or state office again. Okay? So the language of the Constitution completely demolishes the argument that somehow the Second Amendment in invisible ink creates a right to overthrow the government. But what, as an historian, do you say to that argument, which is blockading us from passing the most simple, common sense reforms that are completely consistent with the Second Amendment as spelled out by Justice Scalia in Heller versus District of Columbia? What do you say to it?
Yeah, I think that history is entirely as dispositive as a constitutional argument, right? It's not weaker than, it is an addition to, right? So there are a few things that one could point to, but one is, the Second Amendment used to be called the Lost Amendment because it was never cited or used by anybody for any purpose whatsoever, because it was just understood within the states and in municipalities that if you could have some gun safety regulations, and states and municipalities over the country always did. And the only time that it's not until 1939 in Miller versus U.S. that there is any claim that that the Second Amendment involves an individual right to bear arms. It's up until 1939, it is really just
militia-based.
It's just understood as like that you have a right to have a militia, and the way you parse the sentence, you can go back to Madison's original phrasing or whatever. Like it's a 9-0 decision. There is no individual right to it. The case in 1939 was in 1934 and in 1938. Congress had passed the Federal Firearms Act and the National. I'm like as if I'm explaining something to you that you already know. This is for you guys.
And the NRA, by the way, supported
those. And the NRA supported those.
Yeah.
And there was a challenge to it, and the court's like, well, obviously the federal government has a right to pass these things. It was basically criminalizing machine guns, which is why we don't have machine guns anymore. Yeah. So you're like, okay, from 1789 to 1939, it's like just not a thing. So what happens in 1968 when the Gun Control Act that's passed in response to the assassination of JFK finally gets through Congress, which also the NRA supported. Yeah. You just have to recover the political history from 1968 to 2023, and that is a very specific political history in which people on the pretty far right end of the Republican Party at that time, who are now the Republican Party, decided after 1968, and certainly by 1971, that gun rights would be a great white rights issue as a kind of backlash against civil rights. There was a lot of backlash against civil rights, but the model of seeking constitutional rights through mass political movement and pressure on a court seemed to be a really good one. So the political idea was, we'll do that, but we'll do that for white men who are feeling aggrieved and left behind. And so this will be the thing that we will use. And it's a very emotional, it's easy to kind of gin people up about it by suggesting that it's a right that's about to be taken away from you. But in order to do that, you first have to invent the idea that it is such a right. And so there's just this enormous amount of work that goes on that's largely funded by the NRA, academics who get grants from the NRA, to kind of come up with this, the individual, not just the individual rights argument, but by the 80s, the insurrection argument, which is what lies behind, Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City and the Michigan militia and those militia movements of the 90s.
And January 6th.
And gets you all the way down to January 6th.
Yeah.
And you think about, I recognize people run for office and, they have a kind of, I'm going to do what's necessary to win and then I'm going to do the right things. But then you think about the moral depravity of deciding to fight for that, to fight for the right for an armed nation to be able to stage an insurrection against a sitting democratic government. That's your political move for generations.
It's pretty shocking.
It's
right?
pretty shocking.
Yeah. I mean, when I point all this stuff out to them, they come back with two things. One, they say, well, what about Patrick Henry? He said, live free or die, which was like an 18th century bumper sticker, right? And he was an anti-federalist who voted against the Constitution. So it would be like, turning to Robert E. Lee to ask him for his views on the 14th Amendment or something, So, and then they say, well, what about the American Revolution itself? The Declaration of Independence, which does say absolutely when in the course of human events, if the government's turned tyrannical after a long train of abuses and usurpations and so on. Yeah, but Jefferson never cited British law or the non-existent British Constitution or the Magna Carta. He said as a matter of natural law, a natural right, people can overthrow a government that turns tyrannical. So if you think that the 2020 presidential election, which Trump's Department of Homeland Security said was the most secure presidential election in American history, if you think that that was an exercise in tyranny akin to King George and what was happening against the colonists, then you can come and you can attack our officers and you can bloody the police and send everybody to the hospital and try to overthrow the election of the government. But if we catch you and we arrest you and we give you due process and the presumption of innocence and a jury of your peers finds that you're guilty, like Stuart Rhodes, the Yale Law School graduate head of those keepers, you're going to prison with hundreds of others of them. And that's where you belong if you want to overthrow our government. We don't have the only constitution on earth which gives you a right to destroy the Constitution.
Yeah.
So
the other thing I would say about that is, and what I would say to your pro-insurrection colleagues is, the triumph of the Constitutional Convention was actually Article 5. It was the ability to amend the Constitution, which was understood to be the alternative to insurrection. And when they sat around and they thought, what are we going to do about it when things need to change? We have to have something that people can do short of insurrection, or else the only way to change a government will be insurrection, which obviously nobody should be doing that. So what we should have? We should have an amendment provision. And the fact that that's broken is its own problem, but they didn't break it. They built it to be used.
That's exactly the point that Lincoln made too. I mean, Lincoln said, if you can try to change things through elections, and if that doesn't work, you can amend the Constitution. But he said insurrection is a violation of the first principle of government, which is the people get to choose our leaders, not a mob that shows up and declares itself a militia. And by the way, it's very clear from the Constitution that the officers of militia are appointed by the state, and the Congress can regulate and organize the militias and call them. So the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, they are not a militia, no matter what they say. That is not the militia, and militias don't show up in kindergartens with AR-15s. I can't believe we're almost out of time here.